The alarms screaming through Serpukhov 1-5 pierced the midnight silence like the wails of dying souls. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stood frozen before the massive computer screens, their red warning lights painting his weathered face in hellish crimson. September 26, 1983, 12:14 a.m. Moscow time. The displays showed what every Soviet officer had trained to fear most. 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles were hurtling toward the motherland. The bunker's automated systems were demanding immediate nuclear retaliation. Soviet doctrine was crystal clear. Launch on warning. Strike first or die first. The computers calculated 25 minutes until impact. In that underground fortress buried 60 miles south of Moscow, one man held the power to ignite World War III. Petrov's hand hovered over the red telephone that would connect him directly to Soviet leadership. One call would set in motion the deaths of hundreds of millions. The weight of every soul on Earth rested in that moment. But something felt wrong. His engineer's mind rebelled against the data flooding his screens. This is the story of the man who trusted his instincts over his orders and saved humanity from nuclear annihilation. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was born into a world at war. September 7, 1939, just 6 days after Nazi Germany invaded Poland, marking the beginning of a conflict that would claim over 70 million lives. Growing up in the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War, young Stanislav witnessed firsthand the devastating power of modern warfare. Cities reduced to rubble, families torn apart, the constant specter of death hanging over every Soviet household. His childhood in Vladivostok, far from the European battlefields, was nonetheless marked by rationing, blackouts, and the ever-present knowledge that the enemy could arrive at any moment. These formative experiences instilled in Petrov a deep understanding of war's true cost. Unlike many military officers who knew only peacetime service, he had lived through humanity's capacity for mass destruction. After completing his education in electrical engineering, Petrov was conscripted into the Soviet Air Defense Forces in 1962. His technical background made him invaluable in an era when nuclear warfare increasingly depended on sophisticated computer systems and satellite technology. The military recognized his talent for understanding complex electronic systems, and he quickly rose through the ranks. By 1972, Petrov had been assigned to the ultra-secret Serpukhov 1-5 facility, officially known as the Command Center of the Air Defense Forces. This underground bunker, buried deep beneath the countryside south of Moscow, served as the nerve center for Soviet early warning systems. Here, officers monitored American missile silos, submarine movements, and bomber flights around the clock. The facility represented the cutting edge of Cold War technology. Banks of computers processed data from satellites positioned thousands of miles above Earth. Radar installations across the Soviet Union fed information to these central processors, creating a comprehensive picture of potential threats. The men who worked in this bunker understood that their vigilance stood between peace and nuclear holocaust. Petrov's colleagues described him as methodical and thoughtful, more engineer than soldier. Unlike career military officers who followed orders without question, he possessed an analytical mind that questioned data and searched for logical explanations. His supervisors valued this trait when troubleshooting technical problems, but it would prove controversial when applied to military protocols. The Soviet nuclear doctrine of the early 1980s emphasized speed over deliberation. American missiles could reach Soviet targets in 30 minutes or less. This compressed timeline meant that decisions about nuclear retaliation had to be made almost instantly. There was no time for careful analysis or diplomatic consultation. The system was designed to function with minimal human input, reducing the risk of hesitation that might doom the Soviet Union. Petrov understood these realities, but he also recognized the system's vulnerabilities. Computer glitches, satellite malfunctions, and human error could trigger false alarms. The consequences of mistaking a technical problem for an actual attack were too terrible to contemplate. Every day he spent in that bunker, he hoped his skills would never be put to the ultimate test. The year 1983 brought the Cold War to its most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 decades of nuclear buildup had created an arsenal capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. The Soviet Union possessed over 40,000 nuclear warheads. The United States maintained nearly 24,000. Both superpowers had adopted hair-trigger alert systems that could launch hundreds of missiles within minutes of detecting an attack. President Ronald Reagan's rhetoric had inflamed tensions to unprecedented levels. His March 8 speech, branding the Soviet Union an evil empire, sent shockwaves through Moscow. Reagan's massive military buildup, including the Strategic Defense Initiative dubbed Star Wars by critics, convinced Soviet leadership that America was preparing for nuclear war. The paranoid atmosphere in the Kremlin reached levels not seen since Stalin's final years. The September 1st downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 had pushed both nations to the brink. When Soviet interceptors shot down the civilian airliner after it strayed into restricted airspace, killing 269 passengers, including an American congressman, the world seemed poised for war. Reagan called the incident an act of barbarism, while Soviet leaders insisted they had defended their territory against a spy mission. Military exercises on both sides took on ominous new dimensions. Operation Able Archer 83, NATO's annual nuclear warfare simulation scheduled for November, would use realistic procedures and coded communications indistinguishable from actual war preparations. Soviet intelligence agencies warned their leadership that the exercise might serve as cover for a real first strike. KGB stations across Europe received orders to watch for signs of imminent attack. The new Soviet satellite early warning system, designated OKO, added another layer of instability to the situation. Launched in 1982, the system used infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of American missiles during their boost phase. Unlike ground-based radar systems that required missiles to rise above the horizon, satellites could spot launches almost immediately. This capability promised to extend Soviet warning time from 15 minutes to nearly 30 minutes. However, OKO remained largely untested under real conditions. The satellites had successfully identified scheduled American test launches, but engineers worried about false signals caused by reflected sunlight, electronic interference, or equipment malfunctions. The system's complex computer programs had to distinguish between genuine missile launches and dozens of phenomena that produced similar signatures. Soviet military doctrine demanded that any confirmed missile attack trigger immediate retaliation. The launch on warning policy meant that Soviet missiles would begin flying toward American targets before enemy warheads reached Soviet territory. This strategy aimed to ensure that even a successful first strike would not prevent devastating retaliation. The Americans maintained a similar policy, creating a situation where both sides' nuclear arsenals remained poised on a hair trigger. Intelligence reports flowing into Moscow painted an increasingly paranoid picture of American intentions. KGB analysts interpreted every American military exercise, diplomatic statement, and technological development as evidence of impending attack. The Soviet leadership, dominated by aging officials who remembered the devastation of World War II, took these warnings seriously. Serpukhov 1-5 reflected these heightened tensions. Security measures were tightened. Alert levels were raised. The officers monitoring American activities knew that war could begin at any moment, triggered by accident, miscalculation, or deliberate aggression. In this atmosphere of mutual suspicion and technological complexity, the stage was set for a crisis that would test every assumption about nuclear deterrence. The night of September 25th passed quietly at Serpukhov 1-5. Stanislav Petrov had begun his shift as duty officer for the early warning systems at midnight, settling into the familiar routine of monitoring satellite feeds and radar displays. The bunker hummed with the steady noise of computers processing data from across the Soviet Union's vast detection network. Everything appeared normal as the clock approached 12:15 a.m. Then the alarms erupted. Petrov's blood turned to ice as the main computer screen flashed bright red. The display showed a single American intercontinental ballistic missile launched from Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. The system designated it as a Minuteman III, capable of delivering a 335 kiloton warhead with devastating accuracy. Flight time to Moscow, 25 minutes. The automated systems immediately began their programmed response. Warnings flashed across multiple screens. Klaxons wailed throughout the bunker. The computer calculated trajectory, impact zones, and recommended countermeasures. According to Soviet doctrine, Petrov should immediately contact his superiors and recommend nuclear retaliation. But something seemed wrong. American nuclear strategy called for massive first strikes designed to cripple Soviet retaliation capabilities. Why would they launch just one missile? It made no tactical sense. A single warhead, even targeted at Moscow, would not prevent devastating Soviet counterattack. The Americans knew this. Their war plans called for hundreds of missiles launched simultaneously. Before Petrov could fully process this inconsistency, the situation became exponentially worse. 4 more missiles appeared on his screens. The computer systems showed 5 American ICBMs racing towards Soviet territory. The displays indicated launches from multiple bases across the American Midwest. The pattern suggested a limited first strike aimed at Soviet command centers. The bunker erupted into controlled chaos. Technicians scrambled to verify the data. Communication officers prepared to contact military leadership. The facility's commander arrived within minutes, demanding immediate assessment of the threat. Everyone looked to Petrov for answers he didn't have. Soviet early warning protocols were designed for speed, not deliberation. The compressed timeline of nuclear warfare meant that confirmation had to come quickly or not at all. Ground-based radar stations might detect incoming missiles, but only after they rose above the horizon. That would leave perhaps 15 minutes for decision-making. The satellite system was supposed to provide additional warning time, but it also introduced new possibilities for error. Petrov stared at the screens, showing 5 red dots tracking towards Soviet territory. The computers insisted the attack was real. The satellites had detected multiple launches using infrared sensors calibrated to identify missile exhaust signatures. The system had performed exactly as designed, providing early warning of incoming American warheads. Yet doubt gnawed at his engineering mind. 5 missiles represented a token attack by American standards. The United States possessed over 1,000 CBMs capable of reaching Soviet targets. If they intended to launch a first strike, why use less than 1% of their arsenal? It violated everything Soviet intelligence knew about American nuclear doctrine. The red telephone sat on his desk, its receiver waiting to connect him directly to Soviet military command. One call would set the nuclear retaliation sequence in motion. Soviet missiles would launch within minutes, racing toward American cities. The decision that could end human civilization rested in his hands. Stanislav Petrov's mind raced as he studied the data flooding his screens. The satellite system showed 5 distinct missile launches from American territory, each following a ballistic trajectory toward the Soviet Union. The computers had verified the signatures multiple times. According to every protocol and procedure, he should immediately report the attack to his superiors. But his engineer's instincts rebelled against the evidence before him. Something fundamental didn't add up. American nuclear strategy, as understood by Soviet intelligence, emphasized overwhelming first strikes designed to cripple retaliation capabilities. The Pentagon's war plans called for thousands of warheads delivered simultaneously. 5 missiles wouldn't achieve strategic objectives. They would only guarantee massive Soviet counterattack. The facility commander stood behind Petrov, demanding answers. Other officers crowded around the monitoring stations, waiting for confirmation. The automated systems continued their relentless countdown. 22 minutes to impact, 21 minutes, 20 minutes. Each passing second brought the supposed American warheads closer to Soviet soil. Petrov's hands trembled as he reached for the red telephone. Soviet doctrine was unambiguous. Launch on warning meant exactly that. Don't wait for confirmation. Don't hesitate. Don't allow the enemy to achieve surprise. The system was designed to function with minimal human input precisely to avoid the paralysis that might doom the Soviet Union. Yet he hesitated. His technical training told him that complex systems could malfunction. Satellites might misinterpret reflected sunlight as missile exhaust. Computer programs might generate false signals. Electronic interference could corrupt data transmissions. The OCO system remained relatively new and largely untested under actual combat conditions. The ground-based radar stations that should confirm the satellite warnings remained silent. These installations, positioned across the Soviet periphery, provided the most reliable method of detecting incoming missiles. Their massive antennas could track objects with pinpoint accuracy once they rose above the horizon. But the radar stations reported no incoming missiles. This discrepancy should have resolved the crisis in Petrov's favor, but the timing created additional uncertainty. Radar confirmation might come too late to matter. If American missiles were indeed approaching, Soviet leaders needed immediate warning to authorize retaliation. Waiting for radar confirmation could mean the difference between mutual destruction and Soviet defeat. Telephone calls began flooding the bunker from military installations across the Soviet Union. Commanders demanded to know if the alerts were genuine. The facility's communication systems buzzed with urgent messages from Moscow. Everyone wanted answers that Petrov didn't possess. His training screamed at him to follow protocol, report the attack, let higher authority make the decision, cover his responsibility by adhering to established procedures. Military careers were built on following orders, not questioning them. The consequences of failing to report a genuine attack would be catastrophic for both his country and his personal future. But the consequences of reporting a false alarm might be even worse. If Soviet leaders believed American missiles were incoming, they would launch immediate retaliation. Soviet ICBMs would begin flying toward American cities within minutes. The United States would detect the launches and respond with their own massive strike. Within hours, both superpowers would cease to exist as functioning societies. Petrov closed his eyes and tried to think clearly. The satellite data insisted the attack was real. The computer systems had performed their analysis and reached unanimous conclusions. 5 American missiles were approaching Soviet targets. But the pattern made no strategic sense, and ground-based radar found nothing. 18 minutes to impact. 17 minutes. 16 minutes. Time was running out for rational analysis. Soon, the decision would be made by default. If he didn't report the attack immediately, it might be too late for Soviet retaliation. The weight of history pressed down on Stanislav Petrov as he stared at the red telephone. Every instinct honed by years of military training demanded that he follow protocol and report the incoming missiles. The computer screens continued their relentless display of American ICBMs tracking toward Soviet territory. Automated systems calculated impact times with mechanical precision. The bunker's communication equipment crackled with urgent messages from military installations across the USSR. 15 minutes to impact. 14 minutes. 13 minutes. Petrov's hand reached for the telephone receiver, then stopped. His engineering background had taught him to trust data, but also to question systems that produced anomalous results. The satellite warnings insisted that 5 American missiles were approaching, yet ground-based radar stations, the most reliable confirmation method, detected nothing. The contradiction bothered him more than the time pressure. He turned to his technical staff and demanded additional analysis. Could the satellites have malfunctioned? Might reflected sunlight from high-altitude clouds create false signatures? Were there any known technical issues with the OCO system that could explain the discrepancy? The technicians scrambled to provide answers, but their responses remained inconclusive. The facility commander grew increasingly agitated as precious minutes ticked away. Soviet doctrine allowed no time for extended analysis. The launch on warning policy existed precisely to prevent this kind of paralysis. American missiles could reach Soviet targets in 30 minutes. Decision-makers in Moscow needed immediate warning to authorize retaliation. Every second of delay reduced Soviet options. Yet Petrov couldn't shake his doubts about the attack's logic. 5 missiles represented less than 1% of the American ICBM arsenal. Why would the Pentagon launch such a limited strike? It would achieve nothing except triggering massive Soviet retaliation. American strategic planners weren't fools. They understood that any nuclear attack on the Soviet Union would result in the destruction of the United States. 12 minutes to impact. 11 minutes. 10 minutes. The mathematics of nuclear warfare were brutally simple. Both superpowers possessed enough weapons to destroy each other many times over. Mutual assured destruction meant that any first strike would trigger devastating retaliation. The only rational use of nuclear weapons was to deter their use by others. Launching 5 missiles made no sense within this framework. Petrov made his decision. Despite the computer warnings, despite the satellite data, despite the protocols demanding immediate action, he would not report the attack as genuine. His reasoning was simple but compelling. The pattern didn't match known American doctrine. Ground-based radar found no confirming evidence, and 5 missiles couldn't achieve meaningful strategic objectives. He picked up the red telephone and called his superiors at Soviet military headquarters. Instead of reporting incoming American missiles, he told them that the satellite system was experiencing a malfunction. The warnings were false alarms generated by technical problems. No American attack was in progress. The immediate response was skepticism and anger. How could he be certain? What about the computer analysis? Why were the satellites showing missile launches if none were occurring? Petrov explained his reasoning, emphasizing the tactical inconsistencies and lack of radar confirmation. His superiors demanded that he verify his assessment before they accepted it. 9 minutes to impact, 8 minutes, 7 minutes. The next few minutes stretched like hours as Petrov waited for confirmation of his judgment. If he was wrong, if American missiles were indeed approaching, the consequences would be catastrophic. Soviet retaliation would come too late to prevent American warheads from reaching their targets. The balance of nuclear terror that had preserved peace for decades would collapse in a matter of minutes. But Petrov's analysis proved correct. Ground-based radar stations across the Soviet Union continued to report empty skies. No missile contrails appeared above the horizon. No impact detonations lit up the northern darkness. The supposed American attack existed only in the malfunctioning computers of the Oko satellite system. As dawn broke over the Soviet Union, technical teams began investigating the false alarm. They discovered that the satellites had indeed malfunctioned, misinterpreting reflected sunlight as missile exhaust signatures. The computer programs had processed this corrupted data and reached the logical but incorrect conclusion that American ICBMs were approaching. Petrov had been right to trust his instincts over his training, but being right wouldn't protect him from the consequences of challenging the system. The investigation began within hours of the false alarm. Soviet military officials descended upon Serpukhov 1-5 like vultures, demanding explanations for the system failure and Petrov's unorthodox response. How had the sophisticated Oko satellite network generated such convincing false data? Why had Lieutenant Colonel Petrov chosen to disregard computer warnings that appeared genuine? Most importantly, what safeguards could prevent similar incidents in the future? For Petrov, the inquiry represented a no-win situation. Soviet military culture valued obedience above independent thinking. Officers who followed orders, even mistaken ones, could expect protection from their superiors. Those who made unauthorized decisions, regardless of their ultimate correctness, faced suspicion and punishment. The system rewarded compliance and punished initiative. The technical investigation revealed the cause of the false alarm with embarrassing clarity. The Oko satellites had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, creating infrared signatures that resembled missile exhaust. The computer programs, designed to err on the side of caution, had classified these anomalous readings as genuine launches. The entire crisis had resulted from a predictable interaction between natural phenomena and imperfect technology. This explanation satisfied the technical teams but created political problems for Soviet leadership. Admitting that the early warning system could generate false alarms would undermine confidence in the entire nuclear defense network. If satellites could mistake sunlight for missiles, how could Soviet leaders trust future warnings? The reliability of nuclear deterrence depended on credible detection systems. Rather than acknowledge these vulnerabilities publicly, Soviet officials chose to classify the entire incident. The false alarm of September 26, 1983, was buried in secret files and removed from official records. Personnel involved in the incident received strict orders never to discuss what had occurred. The Soviet government preferred to maintain the illusion of perfect early warning systems rather than admit their limitations. Petrov found himself caught in the middle of this cover-up. His superiors praised him privately for preventing a potential nuclear war, but they couldn't publicly acknowledge his actions without revealing the system's flaws. Instead, they quietly punished him through administrative channels. His promotion prospects vanished. Preferred assignments went to other officers. His military career effectively ended, though he remained formally in service. The psychological toll proved even more devastating than the professional consequences. Petrov understood that he had prevented nuclear war, but he couldn't discuss his role with family, friends, or colleagues. The knowledge that he had saved hundreds of millions of lives remained locked away in classified files. He carried the secret alone, watching as the world continued its oblivious existence. His transfer to a less sensitive position came disguised as a routine reassignment. Officially, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov was being moved to help develop new computer systems for air defense. Unofficially, he was being removed from any role that might require similar judgment calls. The military wanted technical experts who would implement decisions, not make them. Petrov's marriage suffered under the strain of his silence and career disappointment. His wife knew something significant had happened, but couldn't understand why her husband had suddenly become withdrawn and bitter. He couldn't explain that he had prevented World War III and was being punished for it. The classification requirements meant that his greatest accomplishment had to remain his deepest secret. By 1984, Petrov's disillusionment with the military had become complete. He submitted his retirement papers and left active duty to work as a civilian engineer. His pension was modest, his prospects limited, but at least he could escape the suffocating atmosphere of official secrecy. The man who had saved the world from nuclear annihilation disappeared into obscurity, forgotten by history and abandoned by the system he had served. The irony wasn't lost on him. American and Soviet leaders continued their nuclear brinkmanship, unaware of how close they had come to mutual destruction. The weapons systems that Petrov had helped monitor continued their deadly vigil, ready to launch at the first sign of attack. The hair-trigger alertness that had nearly caused catastrophe remained unchanged. For the next decade, Stanislav Petrov lived as a private citizen, working mundane jobs and keeping his monumental secret. The world moved on. Cold War tensions gradually eased, and nuclear arsenals slowly decreased. But the fundamental problems that had created the September 26th crisis remained unresolved. Automated systems still possessed the power to trigger global catastrophe. Human judgment remained the final safeguard against technological failure and nuclear annihilation. The walls of secrecy surrounding September 26, 1983, began cracking with the Soviet Union itself. As Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika opened previously forbidden topics to public discussion, some military incidents that had been classified for years started emerging into daylight. However, the Petrov incident remained buried deep in state archives, known only to a handful of officials who had sworn never to reveal what had occurred. The first hints of the story appeared in 1991, buried in a footnote of a Russian military publication discussing early warning systems. A brief mention of a false alarm incident in 1983 caught the attention of Western intelligence analysts, but the reference was too vague to understand its significance. It would take several more years before the full dimensions of the crisis became clear. In 1995, more than a decade after the incident, Russian military officer General Yuri Votintsev provided the first detailed account of what had happened at Serpukhov 1-5. Speaking at a conference on nuclear security, Votintsev described how a satellite malfunction had nearly triggered nuclear war and how a single officer's judgment had prevented catastrophe. He didn't initially name Petrov, referring only to the duty officer who saved the world. Western journalists and researchers began investigating the story, tracking down participants and piecing together the timeline of events. The process was complicated by Russian officials' continued reluctance to discuss nuclear security issues and the scattered nature of surviving documentation. Many records had been destroyed during the Soviet collapse, and witnesses had to be persuaded to violate their oaths of secrecy. Stanislav Petrov himself remained reluctant to discuss his role, even after the story began emerging in Western media. Years of enforced silence had made him cautious about publicity. When journalists contacted him in the late 1990s, he initially denied involvement or claimed his role had been exaggerated. The habits of secrecy died hard, and he feared potential consequences from speaking openly about classified events. The breakthrough came in 1998 when documentary filmmaker Errol Morris featured Petrov's story in a film about nuclear near misses. For the first time, Petrov agreed to discuss the incident on camera, providing his personal account of the September night when computer screens showed incoming American missiles. His calm, matter-of-fact description of preventing nuclear war captivated audiences and brought international attention to his story. Recognition followed slowly but steadily. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens presented Petrov with an award for preventing nuclear war. The citation noted that his refusal to report the false alarm had probably saved the lives of millions of people. Other honors followed from peace organizations and nuclear disarmament groups around the world. Yet Petrov remained ambivalent about his growing fame. In interviews, he insisted that he had simply done his job and that anyone with technical training might have reached the same conclusion. He seemed uncomfortable with descriptions of himself as a hero, preferring to emphasize the systemic problems that had created the crisis. The real issue, he argued, wasn't his individual decision but the hair-trigger nuclear alert systems that made such incidents possible. The revelation of Petrov's story coincided with growing scholarly interest in nuclear near misses during the Cold War. Researchers documented dozens of incidents where technical failures, misunderstandings, or human error had brought the superpowers dangerously close to war. The September 26th incident joined a catalog of barely avoided catastrophes that illustrated the fragility of nuclear deterrence. These revelations had practical implications for nuclear policy debates. Arms control advocates used Petrov's story to argue for reduced alert levels and additional safeguards against accidental war. Military officials acknowledged the need for improved early warning systems, but insisted that deterrence required credible threats of retaliation. The fundamental tension between nuclear readiness and nuclear safety remained unresolved. For Petrov, the attention brought both satisfaction and regret. He appreciated recognition for his role in preventing catastrophe, but he worried that focusing on individual heroism might obscure the larger lessons of the incident. The world had come within minutes of nuclear war, not because of deliberate aggression, but because of technological failure and flawed decision-making systems. Until those underlying problems were addressed, similar crises remained possible. Stanislav Petrov died quietly on May 19, 2017, at his modest apartment in Fryazino, a small town outside Moscow. He was 77 years old and had lived for decades in relative obscurity, known to his neighbors as a retired engineer who kept to himself. The man who had prevented nuclear war passed away as he had lived after September 1983, without fanfare or recognition from the Russian government he had served. The world learned of his death months later, when his son contacted journalists to announce that the officer who had refused to start World War III was gone. Tributes poured in from around the globe, acknowledging the debt humanity owed to a man who had trusted his judgment over his orders during the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. Petrov's story serves as a haunting reminder of how close civilization came to ending on that September night in 1983. His decision to classify the satellite warnings as false alarms was based on logic, technical knowledge, and intuition, but it was also a profound act of courage. He risked his career, his reputation, and potentially the survival of his own country by refusing to follow protocols designed to ensure rapid nuclear response. The incident illuminates the fundamental paradox of nuclear deterrence in the computer age. The weapons systems designed to protect nations from attack can themselves trigger the very catastrophe they were meant to prevent. Automated early warning systems, compressed decision timelines, and hair-trigger alert postures create conditions where technical failures can escalate into global destruction within minutes. In an era when 9 nations possess nuclear weapons and early warning systems have become even more complex, Petrov's story remains urgently relevant. Cyber attacks, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic missiles have added new dimensions to the risks of accidental war. The safeguards that prevented catastrophe in 1983 may not be sufficient for the challenges of the 21st century. Perhaps most importantly, Petrov's experience demonstrates the critical role of human judgment in systems designed to operate automatically. The computers at Serpukhov 1-5 performed exactly as programmed, analyzing satellite data and recommending nuclear retaliation. Only human intuition recognized that something was wrong with this mechanically perfect response. As nations continue to develop increasingly sophisticated weapons systems, the lesson of September 26, 1983, grows more vital. Technology can process information with superhuman speed and accuracy, but it cannot replicate the contextual understanding, moral reasoning, and instinctive wisdom that led Stanislav Petrov to trust his doubts over his orders. The quiet engineer who saved the world understood that the greatest threats to human survival often come not from deliberate malice, but from the unintended consequences of our own creations. In choosing humanity over protocol, doubt over certainty, and peace over procedure, he ensured that tomorrow would arrive for billions of people who never knew his name.